The sky over Newport shimmered with late afternoon sun, gold washing over the surf and the endless rows of white folding chairs lined up on the green lawn of the Astor Grand. Every detail of Emma's wedding was exquisite, sharp, and expensive, the kind of extravagance that made strangers pull out their phones for pictures even before the ceremony began. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved among the guests, their trays balanced with flutes of Perrier Jouet. At the edge of the crowd, I stood feeling slightly out of place, my hand tightening around the polished walnut cane I'd carried for years. I could hear the music swelling in the background, the elegant strings and the chatter of well-dressed guests. Names I recognized from business columns, politicians, entrepreneurs, old-money heiresses, and yet the laughter in the air never quite reached me. My daughter, Emma Doyle, was the heart of the day, a vision in her ivory silk dress. She moved with the quiet confidence she'd carried since childhood, though I wondered if anyone else could see the tightness in her smile, the faint tremor in her hands as she adjusted her veil. Maybe only a father notices things like that. She hugged her friends with a rehearsed joy, her words a little too careful, her eyes flicking toward me every so often as if searching for a lifeline. Chad Whitaker, her soon-to-be husband, strode through the crowd like he owned the place, chin lifted, charm pouring off him like aftershave. Chad came from money, the kind that wasn't earned but inherited, polished to a shine through generations of country clubs, Ivy League degrees, and family photos on the wall of the New York Yacht Club. He smiled at everyone except occasionally at me. His smile for me always held a trace of amusement, as if I were the entertainment rather than the father of the bride. I thought I was prepared for the spectacle, for the pageantry and privilege. But I didn't expect the moment that changed everything. It happened so quickly, so publicly, it didn't feel real at first. The speeches had been made. Laughter and applause still echoed when Chad, grinning, raised a glass to toast the family's new beginnings. My glass was still full, untouched. I caught Emma's eyes from across the table, her look pleading, nervous. Chad's father, Wallace Whitaker, leaned back in his chair, smirking as Chad turned to me with a glint in his eye. He made some joke about how working-class grit always got things done. Laughter bubbled around us, polite and sharp. Then, suddenly, he was reaching for me. His hand grabbed my shoulder, and before I could react, he pushed my face straight into the towering wedding cake. The crowd gasped. Icy frosting and soft sponge filled my mouth and nose, the heavy, sugary scent overwhelming as it stuck to my skin, my hair, my suit. For a split second, time stretched out, slow and silent, while every guest at that party watched my humiliation, some with horror, some stifling a nervous laugh, others filming on their phones, the light from their screens flickering like fireflies in the dusk. My mind spun through 1,000 thoughts. The sharp pain of embarrassment, the instinctive urge to lash out, the sting of Emma's face frozen in shock, the ripple of whispers spreading like wildfire. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, not just from the public disgrace but from the flood of memories, of nights spent working overtime to pay for Emma's tuition, of holding her hand in hospital waiting rooms when her mother was dying, of building a quiet, honest life in Scranton. Every sacrifice made invisible by one stupid, cruel act. I pulled back, wiped icing from my eyes. The room was utterly silent, the kind of silence that sucks the oxygen from your lungs. I looked at Chad. He expected rage. He expected me to yell, maybe to start a scene that would cement his power in front of everyone. Instead, I stared at him, and something colder than anger moved through me. I stood up, straightened my shoulders, and locked eyes with him until his laughter faded and his smile faltered. No one moved. No one knew what to do. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice broke through the silence. "Is that Frank Doyle?" It was a question, but it landed like a grenade. Suddenly, attention shifted. Heads turned. The name moved through the guests, some of whom worked in finance or tech, who remembered headlines from years ago. Doyle Ventures. Is that him? The shift in energy was electric. Where a moment ago I was the butt of a joke, now I was a riddle no one understood, a problem suddenly much more complicated. Chad's expression crumbled. He hadn't known, of course. Nobody did, not even Emma, just how much I had built. slowly, quietly, over decades, never flashing wealth, always living below the radar. He saw only the quiet, middle-class dad, the man in an off-the-rack suit, never asking for attention, never expecting it. He didn't know about the early investments, the company exits, the years of growing my firm from a basement office with borrowed furniture to a private equity portfolio that put me on the invite lists of people like the Whitakers, even though I rarely accepted. Emma's hand covered her mouth. Wallace looked as if he'd swallowed a stone. Suddenly the wedding wasn't about them. It was about me. For a moment, I could almost taste victory. I could say a word and destroy their pride, reveal their cruelty to every person who mattered in their world. I could turn this humiliation into a weapon and watch them beg for forgiveness. But I said nothing. I didn't need to. I looked at Emma, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't just fear or shame. It was a plea for me not to make it worse. So I turned away from the cake, took my handkerchief, and carefully wiped my face, frosting falling in clumps onto the marble floor. It would have been easy to take revenge right there, to turn the tables on Chad and his family in front of their friends, to use the moment to crush them the way they tried to crush me. But something held me back. I remembered every lesson I taught Emma about dignity, about patience, about letting people show you who they truly are when they think you have nothing to offer. I remembered every time I'd been underestimated, talked down to, dismissed. I remembered how, for years, people like the Whitakers had treated men like me as obstacles to be stepped over, never realizing we were the ones holding up the world they lived in. As I stood there, cake dripping from my hair, the silence grew deeper, weighted with possibility. People watched me not with pity but with a kind of uncertain awe, as if waiting for me to reveal the punchline of a joke they suddenly realized wasn't funny at all. I could see Chad sweating, his charm slipping, his confidence leaking away. I could see Wallace shifting uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the party might be over, that the future might not belong to him anymore. I turned to the crowd, nodded once, and walked away from the table, my back straight, every step deliberate. My heart thundered in my chest, not just with anger, but with a rising sense of power, of control, of a story just beginning to turn. I could hear Emma calling after me, her voice cracking, lost in the storm of gossip and confusion swelling behind me. As I stepped outside, the air sharp and cold, the sound of the surf crashing against the rocks, I realized that Chad and his family had just made the worst mistake of their privileged lives. They'd drawn first blood, but the war was only beginning. The moon was rising over the Atlantic, silver on the water, and I wiped the last of the icing from my lips. I stood alone on the stone steps, hearing the faint sounds of panic behind me as whispers spread, as people asked questions Chad could not answer. I took a deep breath, let the cold air settle my nerves, and for the first time in years, I felt the old fire stirring in my gut. I thought of every insult, every condescending laugh, every time I'd watched people like Chad get away with things because no one thought to stop them. I thought of Emma, her future hanging in the balance, her life at the mercy of people who believed kindness was weakness. The night was not over. The story was just beginning. And if there's one thing men like me know, it's that real power doesn't have to shout to be heard. Real power waits, and then it takes everything. The guests would not forget what they'd seen. The Whitakers would not sleep easy tonight. And Chad would never see what was coming for him. Not until it was far too late. The world outside the Astor Grand was quieter than I remembered. I stood at the edge of the parking lot, beneath a row of ancient oak trees whose branches creaked in the ocean wind. The roar of the waves seemed distant, muffled by the ringing in my ears. Somewhere far behind me, the wedding celebration struggled to reassemble itself, waiters scraping frosting from the floor, guests pretending they hadn't just witnessed a public execution of dignity. For a while, I just stood there, letting the salt air burn my skin, the shock of humiliation transforming into something harder, something clearer than anger. I thought about Emma, about the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. There are things only a parent remembers. The way your child looks at you after their first heartbreak, the way their hands still seek yours in a crowded room, even after they've learned to drive or pay their own rent. I remembered the years when it was just the two of us in that little brick house on Mulberry Street in Scranton. The kitchen painted a faded yellow, linoleum floors scarred from decades of use. I could still see her sitting at the wobbly table, legs swinging, asking questions about everything and nothing, always hungry for stories. I told her about heroes who didn't wear capes, about loyalty and sacrifice, about the simple grace of kindness. Maybe I told her those things as much for myself as for her. I wanted her to believe the world could be good. I wanted her to be stronger than the disappointments that I knew would come for her, sooner or later. After my wife died, everything became a test of endurance. I worked 2 jobs, odd hours, overtime whenever it was offered. There were months when the lights almost got shut off, when dinner was boxed macaroni and whatever canned vegetables I could find on sale. I hid most of it from Emma, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want her childhood shaped by the heaviness of adult worries. I told her we were simple folks, and in Scranton that was still a kind of pride. The truth was, I was building something in secret, teaching myself finance after midnight, reading books I borrowed from the public library, learning to spot patterns in the market that other people missed. I invested every spare dollar, most of them failing until one didn't. Then another. Luck, patience, and stubborn faith. I never flaunted it, never changed how we lived. Emma never wanted for anything important, and that was enough for me. Now, in Newport, all that history felt fragile, like a sheet of glass stretched too thin over a pit of memory. What happened with Chad had been ugly, but it wasn't new. The world had always made sport of people who didn't know their place. What stung was the way Emma's eyes had darted between me and her new family, the way her voice had trembled when she tried to speak. I wondered if she saw herself reflected in me, if she was ashamed of the old truck I drove or the suit that had been let out and rehemmed 6 times. I wondered if she regretted every pizza night, every late-night talk in that creaky kitchen, every lesson about dignity and work and forgiveness. Chad's family, the Whitakers, were the opposite of everything I'd spent my life building. Old money, new arrogance. The kind of people who measured worth in terms of club memberships and surnames, who talked about charity like it was a tax deduction instead of a calling. I'd seen the signs from the first time I met Chad's father, Wallace. His limp handshake, the slow scan of my shoes, the quick glance at his watch every time I tried to make conversation. Emma never saw it. Or maybe she did, but she wanted so badly to belong, to prove that she could bridge the gap between our world and theirs, that she ignored every warning. I'd watched her shrink a little with every dinner, every pointed comment about the right kind of people, every story told at her expense. And still, I held my tongue, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to believe that love could soften even the hardest hearts. I took a slow breath, my chest aching, and made my way to the car. The truck was parked at the far edge of the lot, its paint faded from too many winters, a crack running the length of the windshield. I climbed in, sat for a moment in the silence, and stared at my hands. They looked old tonight. Veins raised, knuckles swollen, the scars of 100 small accidents. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, closed my eyes, and for the first time since the ceremony began, let myself grieve. Not for the cake, not even for the humiliation. For the feeling that I'd lost my daughter, not to marriage, but to a world that had no use for people like us. But grief is a poor master. After a while, the pain gave way to something else, a memory that had lingered for years just below the surface. When Emma was 12, she brought home a stray dog, mangy and limping, half-starved. She begged me to let her keep it. I was exhausted, angry about the mess. But when I saw the look on her face, the fierce conviction that she could fix what the world had broken, I couldn't say no. She slept beside that dog for 3 nights, nursed it back to health, taught it to trust again. The dog died old and happy, and Emma learned something about the stubbornness required to love anything that's been hurt. Tonight, I remembered that lesson more than any other. Sometimes you have to let people fall before you can help them stand up again. My phone buzzed, shattering the quiet. For a wild moment, I hoped it was Emma. Instead, it was an old contact, a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in months. The message was brief, a reminder about some paperwork, a nudge about a potential investment. I almost ignored it, but something in me shifted. For years, I'd been careful to keep my business life separate from my family. No headlines, no magazine covers, no pictures on the company website. But now I wondered if that had been a mistake. Maybe I'd hidden too much. Maybe it was time to bring the two halves of my life together, to let the truth do what I'd always hoped it would: protect the people I loved. The drive back to my motel was silent except for the hum of the engine and the crash of the sea beyond the dunes. Newport at night was a city of ghosts, shadows slipping through pools of lamplight, stories half-whispered and lost to the wind. I checked in, climbed the stairs, and locked myself in the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, took off my shoes, and let my mind wander. I thought about the look on Chad's face when he realized who I was, about the way the crowd had shifted, about the way power changes hands not with a scream but with a whisper. That night, sleep did not come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day. I thought about the lessons I'd taught Emma, about the ones I'd learned too late. I thought about my own father, a miner who never made it out of Scranton, who taught me to shake hands like I meant it and to keep my promises even when it hurt. I wondered what he would have done in my place, whether he would have swallowed the humiliation or spit it back in their faces. I wondered whether I'd failed Emma by letting her walk into this marriage, by standing aside instead of fighting for her. But mostly, I wondered what came next. I felt the pieces moving, the story shifting, the sense that something was about to change, something bigger than cake or money or even pride. Morning broke with a sky as gray as steel, clouds rolling in off the Atlantic, the air thick with the threat of rain. I dressed carefully, pulling on the same suit, brushing away the last crumbs of frosting from the lapels. I drove to the bakery on Thames Street and bought a loaf of sourdough, warm and fragrant, something simple to anchor the day. I walked the empty beach, shoes sinking into the cold sand, and thought about the years I'd spent building something from nothing, about the risks I'd taken, the failures and small victories, the quiet pride of a life lived with integrity. In the quiet, I made a decision. I would not let Chad and his family rewrite the story. I would not let Emma lose herself in their world of privilege and cruelty. If I had to risk everything to remind her of who she was, I would do it. I would do it not with threats or anger, but with the same quiet stubbornness that had carried me through every storm. I would remind her that dignity is not something anyone can give or take away. It's something you build, brick by brick, every day of your life. As the tide came in, washing away the footprints I'd left behind, I turned back toward the city, the old fire rekindling in my chest. I called my lawyer, made appointments, reached out to friends I hadn't seen in years. I dug through boxes of old letters and photographs, searching for proof, for stories, for the truth that would set us both free. I was no longer just Emma's father. I was Frank Doyle, and I was done hiding. The next time Chad tried to humiliate me, he would find the ground shifting beneath his feet. The next time Wallace looked down on me, he would see just how far a man can climb when he refuses to quit. By afternoon, the clouds had broken, sunlight pouring down on Newport like forgiveness. I stood in the lobby of the Astor Grand, waiting for Emma. When she arrived, her eyes red, her voice trembling, I hugged her tighter than I had in years. I whispered that I loved her, that I was proud of her, that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, could take that away. She clung to me for a long time, silent, and I knew she understood. Maybe not everything, not yet, but enough. The future was uncertain, the path forward steep. But as I watched Emma walk away, her shoulders squared, her head held high, I knew we were both stronger than the day before. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the first stirrings of hope, the sense that, even after all the heartbreak, there might still be a way home. Secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect it, and sometimes the smallest crack in a perfect facade is enough to let the flood pour through. In the days after the wedding, I felt the walls closing in, not just on myself but on Emma. The calls from Chad's family became colder, more direct. There was a shift in the way invitations were sent, in the way Emma's voice tightened on the phone. Where once she had called me for everything, recipes, advice, just to share her day, now I heard her only in brief, distracted fragments, her words flattened by exhaustion. When she did call, there was always the faintest sound of someone listening in the background, a hesitation before she spoke as if choosing each word for safety, not honesty. I could sense that she was pulling away, and I tried not to take it personally. It's easy, as a parent, to imagine yourself at the center of your child's universe forever, but Emma was a grown woman. Still, there was something off, something colder in the air around her new life with the Whitakers. I tried to give her space, but the silence between us grew heavy, a quiet threat that settled in the bones. Chad had always seemed charming to outsiders, but there was a brittleness to it, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. In Scranton, you learned to spot a man like that early, because you could get hurt if you didn't. It wasn't the money. Money only magnified who you already were. It was the way he handled people who couldn't help him, the way he treated waiters or doormen, the impatience he let slip when he thought no one was watching. I noticed the first time I met him, but I'd buried my doubts for Emma's sake, telling myself she'd see it too, if she needed to. Now, after the wedding, it was as if that mask Chad wore was beginning to crack. It started with small things. Emma called one night, her voice hushed and uncertain, asking for the old password to her college email. When I pressed, she brushed me off, saying she needed it to reset some online accounts, but the unease in her voice lingered. A few days later, I received a letter meant for Emma at my address, a formal notification about a change in her trust funds management. The wording was stiff, cold, and unmistakably Whitaker. I tried to call, but my calls went unanswered. I sent her a text, just a simple "Are you okay?" but got only a heart emoji in response. Nothing else. I knew better than to push, so I waited. But it didn't take long for rumors to start. Someone at the country club called to ask if I was really leaving town for good, if I was selling the house. Another asked if Emma was moving abroad, joining some business expansion. None of it was true, but the fact that these stories were circulating meant only one thing. Chad and his family were reshaping the narrative, rewriting the story of Emma's life, our life without us in it. Restlessness drove me to dig deeper, to look for answers in places I'd long neglected. I called a friend in Philadelphia, a retired detective who owed me a favor, and asked him to check on some public records. I reconnected with an old colleague from my investment days, a woman named Louise, whose network in finance circles was better than any private investigators. Within days, a picture started to emerge, fuzzy at first, then sharpening into something I could not ignore. There were whispers of debts, big ones, tied not just to Chad but to his family's whole operation. Mortgage liens, lawsuits quietly settled, partners squeezed out of deals, assets shuffled between shell companies. The Whitakers' empire was not what it seemed, and Chad was at the center of a complicated dance to keep the illusion of power afloat. Worse, there were traces of Emma's name on some of the documents, papers she never would have signed knowingly. I felt a surge of cold fear, but also anger, a righteous, hard anger that burned away any lingering sense of humiliation from the wedding. They weren't just humiliating me for sport. They were using Emma, too, maybe even planning to take everything she had. It was then that I remembered something from months before, a conversation that hadn't seemed important at the time. Emma had mentioned a family lawyer, a woman named Harper, who'd handled her mother's will. I called Harper's office and left a message, nothing urgent, just asking to review some paperwork. The callback came late that night. Harper's voice was tired but sharp, her words cautious. She hadn't spoken to Emma in weeks, she said. She asked if everything was all right. I didn't know what to tell her, but when I described what I'd found, there was a pause, a heavy, loaded silence. She said she'd look into it. Days passed. I tried to stay busy, to keep my mind from circling the drain, but the anxiety built with every unanswered call from Emma. I found myself pacing the floors at night, revisiting old memories, wondering where I'd failed. My mind ran through every sign I'd missed, every moment I should have done more. I thought about Emma's childhood, about the times I'd taught her how to stand up for herself, to never let anyone define her worth. But what good were those lessons now, if I couldn't reach her? Then, just as suddenly as the silence had settled, a message arrived. It was from Maria, a housekeeper who'd worked for the Whitakers for years, someone I'd met only in passing during the engagement party. Her message was brief and direct. Your daughter is not safe. She needs your help. Don't trust Chad. They are planning something. Call me. My heart pounded as I dialed her number. The call was short, urgent, and Maria's voice trembled as she spoke. She told me Chad and Wallace were forcing Emma to sign papers she didn't understand, that they were isolating her, cutting her off from her friends, even changing the locks on the beach house she and I had visited every summer. The realization that my daughter was trapped, manipulated by people who saw her as a pawn, snapped something in me. I remembered the promise I'd made to her mother on her deathbed, to protect Emma, no matter what. I felt the old instincts kick in, the sense of duty that had carried me through every hardship. But this was not a problem I could solve with money or brute force. This was something that required patience, precision, and the right allies. I met with Louise in a quiet cafe outside Philly, just two old friends with coffee and a manila envelope stuffed with documents. She had done her homework: bank statements, email chains, property records, evidence of backroom deals and hush payments. More importantly, she had found a series of emails from Chad to his lawyer, discussing plans for the Doyle inheritance and ways to maximize leverage with Emma. Seeing it in black and white made the threat real, undeniable. I thanked Louise, tucked the folder under my arm, and left with the weight of a decision pressing on my shoulders. As I drove back to Scranton, memories flooded me. Memories of Emma as a child, the fierce stubbornness in her eyes, the way she never backed down from a fight. I realized that, somewhere along the way, I'd started treating her like a victim, someone to be saved. But Emma had never been helpless. If I wanted to help her, I needed to remind her of who she was, to give her the truth, the tools, the strength to fight back. That night, I wrote her a letter, real pen and paper, not a text or an email. I told her about the investigations, about the secrets I'd uncovered. I reminded her of the lessons we'd shared, of her mother's courage, of the blood and sweat that built our family. I told her I was here, waiting, that no matter what happened, I would never give up on her. I left the letter with Maria, trusting that she would find a way to deliver it safely. The next morning, I waited for a sign, a call, a knock at the door. Hours passed. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, the old refrigerator's rumble. Then, just before noon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Emma. 3 words, simple but powerful. I need you. I felt a surge of hope, tempered by the knowledge of the fight ahead. It was not over. The Whitakers would not let her go easily. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. As I packed my bag and locked the door behind me, I thought about the long road ahead, about the strength it would take to stand against people who believed they could buy anything, including loyalty, silence, and love. I was just a man from Scranton with old hands and a stubborn heart. But I was also Emma's father, and I would not rest until she was free. Revenge, when it finally takes root, doesn't announce itself with fireworks or grand gestures. Creeps in quietly, builds layer by layer until there's no turning back. I felt that slow, building energy in every cell as I stood at the edge of everything I'd built and everything the Whitakers had threatened to take. Maria's message and Emma's 3-word plea echoed in my mind as I pieced together a plan, every detail sharpened by the memory of humiliation and the raw love that only a father can carry. The Whitakers, for all their bravado, never saw it coming. They had spent their lives in a world where problems were solved by money, influence, and erasing the inconvenient. They believed that by isolating Emma, controlling her assets, and manipulating her reality, they could break her spirit and force me out for good. They never expected the man in the cheap suit to be the one holding the fuse, patient enough to let the whole thing unravel from within. After Emma's text, I called Harper and Louise, trusting the network I'd quietly built over decades. While the Whitakers were busy organizing Emma's honeymoon trip to Maui, a facade for another round of signatures, another layer of paperwork designed to box her out, I got to work. Harper dug into the legal side, compiling evidence of coercion, signatures gathered under duress, and the shadow contracts Chad had signed with shell companies tied back to his father. Louise, relentless as ever, called in a few markers of her own, and by the end of the week I had a neat, damning package. Enough proof of fraud and abuse to burn the Whitakers' empire down to cinders. But evidence by itself is silent. I needed witnesses, and I needed a stage. That's where Maria and a handful of other staff came in. It's amazing how much the overlooked see. Maria's memories. Overheard arguments, bruised arms, threats. The way Chad's voice changed behind closed doors were only the beginning. The driver, the house manager, a gardener who'd worked for the family since before Chad was born. All of them had a piece of the truth, and together, it became a story that could not be buried. I coordinated everything from my kitchen in Scranton, sitting at the battered table where Emma had once done her homework, surrounded by legal pads and spreadsheets, cell phone buzzing every few minutes. There's something empowering about taking control, even when you know the storm is coming. I remembered what it felt like to have nothing and realized, finally, that I'd never truly lost that hunger. The Whitakers underestimated me because they'd never been hungry a day in their lives. With every hour, the plan crystallized. The day Emma and Chad landed in Maui, my allies set the wheels in motion. Harper filed an emergency petition with the court. Louise sent carefully redacted copies of our evidence to 3 major business reporters, and Maria arranged for the staff to meet with an investigative journalist who had been circling the Whitaker scandals for years. It wasn't about destroying them publicly, at least not at first. It was about forcing them to face the truth, about giving Emma the proof she needed, and a way out. But the truth rarely stays contained. Within 24 hours, a story appeared on the homepage of a national business website, Whitaker Family Power Games, inside a gilded cage. It was just the start. Screenshots of contracts, transcripts of phone calls, photos of bruises and forged signatures, all accompanied by statements from employees, anonymous but unmistakable. Within hours, investors began to pull their money. Old partners called for audits, and the social media wildfire was unstoppable. I worried about Emma, thousands of miles away, unsure how the news would reach her. My hands shook as I dialed her number, not knowing if she'd answer or if Chad had already shut her phone off. To my relief, she picked up, her voice a whisper edged with fear and relief. I could hear the ocean behind her, the distant shouts of hotel staff as word of the scandal began to trickle across time zones. I told her what we'd done, and for the first time since the wedding, I heard her exhale. A shaky, disbelieving laugh, like someone surfacing after too long underwater. I reminded her to stick to the plan. Stay close to people, keep her documents safe, and wait for the moment to move. As we talked, Chad banged on the hotel door, his voice slipping from charm to threat in a matter of seconds. I listened as Emma calmly told him she was on the phone with her father, her voice steadier than I'd heard in months. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. Meanwhile, the Whitakers scrambled for damage control. Wallace called me directly, his voice desperate and trembling. Gone was the condescension, the lazy superiority. He begged, threatened, tried to bargain. He said I was ruining the family, destroying Chad's future, costing innocent people their jobs. But I held my ground. I told him the same thing I'd always told Emma. Integrity isn't negotiable. You can't buy forgiveness, and you can't erase what you've done by writing a check. By the end of that day, the Whitaker business accounts were frozen pending investigation. Journalists crowded the family's Connecticut estate. Chad's face appeared on news feeds nationwide, the story of his cruelty playing out in headlines and sound bites. Emma, at last, saw the world rally to her side, friends and strangers reaching out, the silence broken at last. She sent me a message. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. The thing about revenge is that it's rarely as satisfying as you imagine. The anger that carried me through sleepless nights dissolved into something else. Relief, sadness, even pity for the Whitakers as their empire collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. But there was pride, too. A stubborn, humble pride that I had not betrayed myself or Emma, or the memory of the woman who taught me that sometimes justice is slow, but it comes all the same. The aftermath unfolded faster than I expected. The Whitaker name became toxic in business circles. Old friends abandoned them. Partners withdrew funding. Wallace faced charges. Chad was called to testify, his every move dissected by hungry reporters. I watched it all from a distance, the television turned down low, the house silent but for the ticking of the old kitchen clock. Emma returned home, the trip to Maui aborted in chaos. She arrived with only a carry-on bag, her face tired but unbroken. When I opened the door, I saw a new determination in her eyes. The steel she'd had as a little girl, the kindness and stubbornness that had survived the worst. We didn't talk about the details that first night. Instead, I made her tea, and we sat at the kitchen table while she let herself breathe. She told me about Chad's last attempt to control her, about the fear and the small acts of resistance that had kept her afloat. It took weeks for the news to die down, for the dust to settle, for Emma to believe it was over. She moved back into the house on Mulberry Street, found work teaching at a local school, started volunteering at the food pantry where her mother had spent so many afternoons. There were days when she cried, when the pain of betrayal and public spectacle felt too much to carry. But there were more days when she laughed, when we remembered who we were, where we came from. The Whitakers faded from the headlines, their wealth unable to shield them from the consequences. I heard that Chad tried to leave the country, that Wallace sold off their last property in a desperate attempt to settle debts. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was Emma, home and safe, her spirit unbroken. What mattered was that, in the end, we'd chosen each other over pride, over money, over the hollow promises of a life that was never really ours. One evening, as summer faded into fall, Emma sat beside me on the porch, the last light of day slipping through the trees. She squeezed my hand and thanked me. Not for the money, not for the revenge, but for always seeing her, for always fighting, even when she pushed me away. I realized then that the true measure of a father isn't how many battles he wins, but how many times he stands by his child when the world turns cold. And so the story that began with a cake and a public humiliation ended with quiet evenings and the kind of peace that comes only after a storm. We had lost things. Illusions, security, the dream of a fairy tale wedding. But what remained was stronger, more real. We had each other. We had the truth. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. In the weeks after the Whitakers' world fell apart, I found myself watching Emma with a kind of awe, as if I was witnessing her become herself all over again. The quiet strength she showed in the face of loss, the way she carried on with daily life even as her name lingered in the headlines, made me realize just how much she'd grown, how much she'd endured and how deeply she understood what mattered. Some mornings, I'd find her in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal with the same focus she once used for her childhood science experiments, her eyes fixed on the sunrise over the backyard. It was a sight I thought I'd lost years ago, when grief and distance first crept in between us. Sometimes the pain came in sudden, unpredictable waves. She'd open a drawer and find a wedding favor she never gave out, or she'd see a news update about Chad's latest legal trouble, and her hands would tremble as she shut off her phone. There were moments when she'd laugh at something I said, the sound so genuine and free that I'd be caught off guard, reminded of the little girl who once begged for one more bedtime story. Then her face would cloud over, remembering, and I'd watch her gather herself, refusing to let sorrow win. We never talked much about the details of what happened. Some things were too raw, too recent to name out loud. But in small ways, every day we found our own language for forgiveness. Sometimes she'd make coffee and pour it into the chipped mug I'd owned for decades, pushing it across the table in silent thanks. Other days, she'd leave a note, just a line or two, about some childhood memory, some kindness I'd forgotten but she had not. I tried not to smother her, to give her the space to heal in her own time. But every instinct I had wanted to pull her close, to promise her the world was still safe, still full of good people. The reality was more complicated. Emma struggled to trust again, and I saw the way she hesitated before accepting invitations, the way she looked twice at every new acquaintance. She was building her boundaries, stone by stone, and though it hurt to see, I knew she needed to do it herself. I remembered how her mother, in her last days, used to say, "She'll find her way. Just be there to hold the light." So I did. As the leaves turned and the air cooled, we began to settle into a new rhythm. Emma started teaching at the community college, pouring herself into her work, giving her students the encouragement and patience she'd once needed herself. I watched her stand in front of a classroom of young adults, her voice clear and steady, her hands open and confident, and I felt a pride deeper than anything I'd known before. At home, she dug out her old journals, the ones she'd filled as a teenager, and read them on the porch in the evening sun, sometimes sharing a line or two with me, reminders of who she'd been and how far she'd come. One evening, as we sat together watching a summer storm roll in, Emma turned to me with an intensity one hadn't seen since she was a child. Her words came out carefully, as if she was choosing each one from a place of long-held pain. She spoke of the shame she'd felt at the wedding, the way Chad's cruelty had made her doubt herself, the fear that she'd disappointed me, that she'd become someone neither of us could recognize. I listened, silent, letting her shape the story in her own way, not rushing to fill the spaces between her words. When she was done, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, grounding herself. "I need to know you forgive me," she whispered, and I saw the truth in her eyes, that all along, it hadn't been the world's judgment that haunted her, but her own. The weight of it pressed on my chest, heavier than I'd expected. I told her what I'd never found the courage to say, that forgiveness wasn't a thing I could give or withhold, that it was baked into every day I'd loved her, every sacrifice, every act of faith. I told her she was the bravest person I knew, and that nothing she'd suffered had made her any less. The tears that came then were quiet, almost cleansing, as if we were letting go of years of silence and misunderstanding. Afterward, we sat in the soft darkness, thunder rolling in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hope take root again. There were still hard days, days when the past pressed in and old wounds ached. Emma sometimes woke from nightmares, her breath ragged, her hands searching for comfort. On those nights, I'd sit with her, holding the old family quilt between us, offering what little comfort I could. We talked about her mother, about all the ways love can heal and wound in equal measure. We remembered the pizza nights, the late drives, the little victories and losses that had built our life together. I watched as Emma slowly reclaimed the things she'd loved, her music, her books, the friendships that had weathered every storm. The world outside was still uncertain, but our home became a place of quiet rebuilding. As the semester went on, Emma became more involved with her students, organizing food drives and tutoring sessions, finding meaning in service. She brought home stories of resilience and struggle, and I saw her pouring the lessons of her own pain into helping others. There was a dignity in it, a hard-won grace. I admired her willingness to open her heart again, to risk kindness after so much betrayal. One Saturday afternoon, as we were sorting through boxes in the attic, Emma found an old photo of us at the county fair, her face smeared with ice cream, her hand gripping mine. She laughed, showing it to me, and in that moment, I saw her as she truly was, unbroken, unashamed, radiant. She tucked the photo into her wallet, a talisman against the dark days. We never forgot what had happened. The scars were real, reminders of a battle survived, but not without cost. There were times when Emma would stare out the window for long stretches, lost in thought, or when she'd decline an invitation to a party, citing work but really needing space. I let her be, trusting that she'd find her way back on her own terms. We spent long evenings walking through the neighborhood, talking about everything and nothing. We planned a small garden, choosing seeds together, hopeful for a new season. Slowly, the world's attention shifted. The headlines faded, the phone stopped ringing with reporters' questions, and the Whitaker name became little more than a cautionary tale. Emma's circle of friends grew, rebuilt on trust and shared experience. I noticed how she chose her company with care, seeking out those who valued kindness and honesty above all. I saw her stand up for herself, gently but firmly, when old acquaintances tried to draw her back into gossip or complaint. One night, as autumn settled in for good, Emma surprised me with a homemade pizza, the crust just like her mother used to make. We ate on the porch, laughing at our mistakes, savoring the simplicity of a meal made with love. In the warmth of that moment, I realized that true revenge was never about destruction or retribution. It was about survival, about building something new from the wreckage, about proving that dignity and love endure long after the world's applause has faded. Emma's journey was far from over, and so was mine. There would be other challenges, other heartbreaks, but we had found each other again. Father and daughter, standing in the light of our own making. We were changed, but not defeated. The future, uncertain as ever, no longer frightened us. In each other, we discovered a resilience that no betrayal could break. And as we sat together under the stars, sharing memories and dreams, I understood at last that forgiveness is not a gift given once, but a practice, renewed every day, in every act of love. The first real snow of the year fell silently in Scranton, erasing the last bright traces of fall from the yard and laying a hush over everything. It was a year since the wedding that wasn't, a year since the truth rose up and split our lives into a before and after. In that time, the world around us had shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes with a violence that left scars. Yet somehow, in the quiet space between disaster and forgiveness, Emma and I had built something new. The house felt smaller, somehow warmer. There were small signs of change everywhere, the result of months spent tending to life's details. Fixing a leaky roof, mending fences, planting bulbs that now slept under the snow. In the living room, shelves sagged under the weight of Emma's books and the modest trophies she won coaching the college debate team. My own life, once filled with endless calculations and a kind of restless ambition, had slowed. I kept the same routines: coffee at 6, a walk around the block, an afternoon spent helping at the food pantry. But my mind no longer raced ahead to tomorrow. Instead, I found myself lingering in the present, grateful for the ordinariness of each day. Emma moved through the world differently now. She was still careful, still guarded, but there was a lightness to her steps, a renewed faith in small acts of goodness. Her laughter came more easily, her voice steadier in the classroom and in the quiet evenings we shared. She didn't talk much about the Whitakers or about Chad, but sometimes, in the lulls between conversations, I would catch her looking out the window as if she were reading her future in the pattern of frost on the glass. There were moments when the past reared up, an unexpected letter from a lawyer, a news report about the final collapse of the Whitaker business empire, the odd email from someone seeking details about the billionaire who lived like a ghost. But mostly, the world forgot us, and in that forgetting we found a kind of peace. Emma poured her energy into the community. She started a small foundation to provide scholarships for first-generation college students, quietly matching every donation from her own savings. She organized after-school reading programs, lobbied for safer streets, and helped bring a food truck to the local park on weekends. Watching her pour herself into these projects, I realized that survival had given way to purpose. She no longer seemed haunted by the question of what others thought of her. The validation she needed now came from within and from the grateful smiles of the people she served. She became a local name, not for scandal, but for compassion and the quiet way she drew people together. For my part, I continued to live simply. I turned down offers from journalists, ignored the occasional letter from distant relatives, hoping for a piece of a story they barely understood. I worked in the garden, read the same battered novels, met with neighbors for coffee at the same diner where Emma and I used to split pancakes on Saturday mornings. I found that what I valued most was not recognition but the comfort of routine, the reliability of small joys. Once, when Emma caught me fixing the old truck in the driveway, she laughed and said I was like a character out of another era. She wasn't wrong, but I didn't mind. In a world obsessed with reinvention, I was content to endure. One day, a letter arrived, handwritten and trembling, from a young woman in Ohio. Her story was painfully familiar. A father who'd lost everything to a predatory investment, a family torn apart by greed, a wedding she feared would become another chapter of humiliation and loss. She'd read about Emma and me somewhere online in a thread about second chances and starting over. She asked for advice, for help, for hope. I read the letter twice, then handed it to Emma, who read it in silence, tears shining in her eyes. Without hesitation, she sat down at the kitchen table and began to write back, her words deliberate, full of hard-won wisdom. She wrote about dignity, about the ways we survive betrayal, about how love, once bruised, can still heal if you tend to it daily. She wrote about forgiveness and about building something new from the rubble. That letter began a correspondence that stretched through winter and into the spring, a quiet reminder that even our deepest wounds can become a source of strength for someone else. News of the Whitakers' downfall faded but never vanished completely. There were civil cases, public apologies, a slow leak of secrets that made it clear just how deep their deception had gone. Chad's face appeared now and then on tabloid covers. The headlines always some variation of rise and fall, redemption and regret. He wrote a memoir or tried to, full of excuses and evasions, but it sold poorly. I felt no satisfaction in his misery, only a distant, tired pity. The only real revenge, I came to realize, was outliving your enemies with your soul intact. On Emma's birthday, we invited the neighbors and some of her students for dinner. The kitchen was crowded and noisy, full of laughter and the smell of bread rising in the oven. At one point, as Emma stood at the sink washing dishes, she caught my eye and smiled. An easy, wordless exchange that said more than any conversation. I realized then that all the money, all the pain, all the battles we'd fought had distilled into this. An ordinary night, filled with ordinary happiness, with nothing left to prove. There were, of course, lingering questions. Was I right to hide my wealth for so long? To test the Whitakers? To force Emma to see the truth in such a brutal way? Had I truly protected her, or simply made the journey harder? The answer, I suspect, lies somewhere in the gray space between love and pride, between justice and mercy. I thought often of Emma's mother in those quiet moments, remembered her belief that wounds heal best in the open, that love is a practice and not a possession. I saw, too, that revenge, when it is only about evening the score, can leave you empty, but that choosing to rebuild, to forgive, to offer kindness even to those who have harmed you, gives life a second act. Emma and I were living proof. Late one evening, as the snow fell heavy against the window and the world felt closed in and safe, Emma and I sat together by the fire, sipping cocoa and listening to the wind. She turned to me and asked if I regretted anything, if I would have changed how things turned out. I thought about all we'd endured, the humiliation and the risk, the sleepless nights, the slow climb back to ourselves. I thought about the people who had helped us, Maria, Louise, Harper, and even strangers who had sent letters of hope. I thought about the life we had built, imperfect and humble, and I told her the truth. I would not change a thing. Not because I was proud of every choice, but because every mistake, every mercy, every second chance had led us here, together in the warmth of a home rebuilt from the ashes. The next morning, the sun rose bright and cold over Scranton. Emma bundled up and went to teach, waving to me from the porch as I stood in the doorway, coffee in hand. I watched her walk down the street, head high, unafraid of whatever the world might bring. I felt the old ache in my chest, a father's pride, and something like peace. After she left, I went to my desk and found a new letter waiting. This one from a man in Texas, a father desperate for advice on how to save his daughter from the mistakes he saw her making. I thought about what I would write, about how every story of betrayal and redemption is unique but also achingly familiar. I thought about what Emma would say, about the wisdom we'd earned together, and I smiled. There is no end to the work of healing, no finish line to forgiveness. It is the small choices, the daily acts of faith that define us. As spring approached, the garden thawed and green shoots pressed up through the earth. Emma and I planted seeds together, hopeful for the harvest to come. I knew there would be more hard seasons, more lessons to learn, more people to help. But I no longer feared the future. We had survived the worst, and in doing so, found the best in ourselves and each other. The world is rarely fair, but sometimes, if you're lucky, it gives you a second chance. A moment to choose grace over bitterness, to mend what was broken, to love without fear. So we carried on, Emma and I, ordinary and unremarkable in the eyes of the world, but richer than we had ever been. The story of the cake, the scandal, the downfall of a dynasty became just that. A story, a cautionary tale, a reminder that character is forged in fire and proven in forgiveness. And in the quiet hours, As the sun set behind the hills and the house filled with the music of our laughter, I understood at last that real revenge was never about bringing others low. It was about rising, together, into the light of a new day.